really matters? That might be the most important question you can ask. So let's talk about it. Welcome to What Really Matters podcast, Everyday Spirituality with Karen Wyatt. Thanks for joining me here again for another episode. And today I'm going to start a little brief series on diving into some of the lessons that we can learn from the Tao Te Ching. Last week, I talked about humility and read several quotes from the Tao Te Ching. And this week, I'm actually going to start diving into the adaptation of the Tao that I just recently published called the Tao of Death. And it utilizes the lessons from the original Tao Te Ching. And I've used a similar format in that of using 81 verses in this adaptation. But in my version, I've incorporated death into the verses so that we have a real feel for the cycle of life and death and the completeness of the whole of life by including death and not leaving it out. So I'm going to dive into some of the verses from the Tao of Death and read those to you today and talk a little bit more about the deeper meaning behind them. And I did want to just remind you that I will leave a link in the show notes, and you can get this book, The Tao of Death, newly published with a new cover, and it includes journaling prompts in the back for each one of the verses if you'd like to use it for contemplation and journaling. And also my other book that's coming out at the same time, which is called Stories from the Dark Night, Writing as a Tool for Grief. It contains many different types of writing that I did over decades as I was working through my grief over my father's suicide death. And so what I say about this book is these stories, essays, and poems are written from within grief rather than being about my grief. And so this shows the creativity that began to flow through me once I kind of opened my heart and allowed my heart to be broken by my father's death and allowed myself to just plunge into this dark night. I found a really rich well of creativity there. So this book is a compilation of many of the writings that I did during that time and continue to do now, actually. So these two books, The Tao of Death and Stories from the Dark Night, are just newly published. You can get them on the webpage eoluniversity.com/books. And there will be links there for where to purchase those books if you're interested. So now we'll get into today's topic, which is one of the major lessons that appears over and over again in the Tao, is the idea that suffering is a pathway to transformation. And this is something that we often don't like to think about. We tend to reject the idea of suffering. We try to avoid it whenever possible. Pretty much all of our Western medical system is set up to despise suffering in any form and to try to eliminate it and rid our lives of it. And yet, suffering can come in many different ways in our lives. There are many different types of suffering. And the Tao makes it clear that we at some point have to turn around and start embracing whatever difficulties have come into our life rather than resisting them and working against them. And so I wanted to share with you just a couple of verses from the Tao of Death that might help us work toward this idea. The first one is verse 60. Just as food should be cooked gently without overstirring, life should be allowed to unfold without too much meddling or control. If you live according to what really matters, you don't need to worry about preventing bad things from happening. When you are in harmony with the way of death, then whatever comes your way is an experience to be embraced, your next opportunity for learning. This is the best way to minimize evil in the world. Be in harmony in everything you do in your own life. And that word harmony also appears throughout the Tao, because that is one of the major goals we should have for our inner life when we're on our inner journey, is finding a way to be in harmony and at peace with life itself and whatever life is bringing to us. Now, when we're on the outward path, and again, for several weeks now, I've been talking about the inward path, the inward arc, and the outward arc. The outward being a time in our lives when we're working toward certain goals of achieving things financially and career-wise, educationally, and perhaps even seeking a partner and buying a house and creating a family. These are all our external goals for our lives. And let's say the first half of life is usually devoted to those goals. But at some point in our lives, we reach an inflection point when those outward goals are no longer enough or satisfying to us. We feel there's something more to life. There's deeper meaning. There's something more to attain. And that can be the beginning of our inward journey, when we start to look inside of ourselves and start to want to learn spiritual lessons and want to grow into the best people we can possibly be, to also grow toward higher consciousness. So it's at that point when the ego begins to lose some of its control over how we see the world and what we see matters. When higher consciousness becomes the lens through which we look at life, everything looks different. And the Tao continually points out the view from higher consciousness and how it comes in contrast with the view from our ego, which is responsible for the outward journey that we've been on. So there's this contrast always going on between what we see on the outside and what we're looking at on our inner journey. But the idea, as this verse 60 says, is to figure out how to be in harmony, how to understand that whatever comes your way is something to simply embrace, to allow, and to also view it with curiosity and a desire to learn whatever you can from whatever happens to you. And so that includes suffering and difficulties. Sometimes what we consider bad things, the ego considers bad things, happen to us. We have an accident and get injured. We get sick and receive a terrible diagnosis. We have a loved one die. We lose our job. We become estranged from someone we cared about. There are many, many of these difficulties that life seems to offer us, one after another, sometimes all at once. Some people are going through multiple losses and difficulties all at one time. But the idea the Tao is putting out there as a goal for us to look toward is, how can I learn to just be in harmony with whatever is happening, especially all these things that I can't control? If I try to control and eliminate the difficulties of my life, I will make myself crazy, because it's not possible to control these things that happen. Look at all the natural disasters that have happened over the last year or two. How many people's lives have been completely disrupted by those, and yet there was nothing that could be done. There was no way to control these things that happen. This is what life brings. And again, we have to figure out, how can we have a mindset that allows us to eventually embrace the things that life brings us? Of course, that's a process too. We're not just automatically going to be at a place of harmony and peace. Maybe very far along in our journey of higher consciousness, we could be at that place, but most likely on our normal path, we're going to go through a lot of different phases of being upset and angry and despondent and feeling despair and sadness. And it's a process to work through in order to get to a place where we can be at peace with the difficulty that has arisen in our lives. And it's actually that process that we go through that helps us transform spiritually. Because every time we grapple with something that's difficult in our lives, and every time we work our way through to a place where we can finally be at peace with it and learn how to live with it, we are expanding our own consciousness. And that means the next difficulty that comes along will be just a little bit easier for us to navigate because we've already been down that road before. We've already done some of this work. So as we go through aging and go into our later lives, we have already learned so much through all the challenges and the difficulties that have happened in our lives. And as difficult as aging and illness and terminal conditions are, and also loss, losing our loved ones, and grief, as difficult as those are, we have already learned so much because we've been through so many situations in the past. We've already done so much of the work, and that is really powerful. And it's amazing when you allow yourself to contemplate your consciousness now, especially if, like me, you're getting older and you're looking back on your life, you can see how, wow, when things happen now, I approach it differently. I have a different mindset. I have different tools that I use. I work through things differently than I did when I was younger. That is the gift of the inward arc. And all the work that we do, even the work that we do when we're not encountering a lot of difficulties, when things are going well, the work we do then will still support us and help us when we reach those times of difficulty. So this is an amazing lesson to think about the fact that our goal should be eventually to be in harmony with everything we do in life and everything that life brings to us. And that's really phenomenal, a phenomenal way to live life if we could actually get to that place of harmony. And next, I'll read you part of another verse from the Tao of Death that gives us a little bit more insight. I'm not going to read the entire verse because this is a longer one, but the first half of the verse talks about strategies for dealing with an enemy during times of war. And then the Tao of Death continues on with this metaphor of dealing with an enemy. And so I'll read the second half of this verse. So too, illness and death arrive in the guise of an enemy, though they are actually messengers to help you learn and grow. Before you attack and seek to eliminate the messenger, make sure you've heard the message. To ignore the value of death and its companions, illness, suffering, and loss, is to dismiss your own potential for transformation. True healing comes to the one who remembers the three essential lessons of the way of death: love, presence, and surrender, and sees no one as an enemy. So let's look back at this verse. The idea that illness and death arrive in the guise of an enemy, looking like this is the worst thing that ever could have happened. This is horrible. But they are actually messengers, and they contain the potential for learning and growth if you can be with them and if you can allow them to be part of your life. And so the warning is, before you attack and try to eliminate the messenger, make sure you heard the message. One of my issues as a doctor in our Western medical system was always that we treated illness as an enemy to be eliminated. And there was never a hesitation or a pause to ask, is there a message? Is there a message that we could learn or something that we could gain from this experience? Let's not leave that out. And so often our Western medical system just approaches any type of illness as an enemy to be eliminated. And I feel that we waste the opportunity that a difficulty can be giving to us to learn something. There might be something there. Yes, if it's possible to eliminate an illness, let's do that. But let's not forget that there could be a message coming along with the illness. And let's make sure we talk about that, or take a pause, or look at the illness through a different lens in order to find out if there's something there that could be learned, something we could glean in order to help us grow spiritually, to grow toward higher consciousness. So I'm not saying don't treat illnesses when they come along. I'm only saying add on this different perspective that I'm going through this challenging experience. I have an illness and I'm in treatment for it right now. But is there anything else I could learn as I'm on this path, as I'm going through it? What else might I learn about myself or about life in general? How else might I grow? And this verse reminds us that there are 3 essential lessons: love, presence, and surrender. And all of those are things you could work on as you're dealing with an illness and as you're receiving treatment for an illness. Could this illness help me learn more about love, how to love others? Could it help me learn how to be more present in this present moment? Could it help me learn to surrender, to let go of trying to control everything, and to allow this to unfold as it does? And so the verse again, the warning is, if you ignore the value of illness, suffering, and loss, then you'll be dismissing the potential that lies within them for transformation. So again, as I said, it's a recurring message throughout the Tao to utilize anything and everything that comes your way, whatever happens, and it may be very unfortunate, very tragic, horrible sometimes, but if you can reach a place where you have enough equanimity to be able to look for an opportunity to learn something, particularly about love, presence, or surrender, that is how you make the most of a challenging situation that you're going through. And granted, all of us are going to go through those difficult things. And that includes loneliness that I talked about a few weeks ago. Being lonely on this spiritual journey is one of the ways that we suffer. And yet it can also be a really rich and ripe time for us to learn new things. And so there are a couple more verses, shorter verses, that I want to read here that have other little insights into this idea that suffering is the path to transformation. This is from verse 78. And it says, "The wisest teachers are the ones who know that our suffering shapes our transformation. And embracing death is the path to a fulfilled life. This wisdom is paradoxical, but true." So another message that comes through over and over in the Tao is that life is full of paradox. And we got a glimpse of some of that last week in talking about humility and ideas like the more you know, the less you understand. And so there's sometimes these paradoxical statements that appear to be opposites, just like life and death appear to be opposites. But in fact, embracing death is how we attain a fulfilled life, because when we can view death and look at death and appreciate the presence of death in our lives, then we're not hiding from anything. We're not pushing any part of life away. We're able to take all of it in. And so that includes all the losses and all the deaths that occur in our lives. And another part of this statement that I really love is the wisest teachers are the ones who know that our suffering shapes our transformation. And I really like thinking about it that way. Like when I look back at the grief I encountered over my father's death, that grief has profoundly shaped how I have grown and changed and what I have learned over the years. And so I'm a different person because of that grief, and grief shaped me into who I am now. And so too will other challenges that come my way in the future. Illnesses, injuries, as I said, other losses, other diagnoses that may come to me. Each one of them adds its own shape. Each one of them helps mold who we are becoming, how we grow, which direction we grow, what we learn. And so in some ways, I like thinking about this idea that the challenges of our lives are like the sculptors, in a way, of our lives. They have shaped us. They've pushed us. They've chipped away at us. They've pressured us in certain ways, and they have molded us into who we are. And part of this equanimity in life is also to embrace who we are, who we have become as a result of all of the sculpting that has happened because of our past suffering. And to, in some ways, appreciate it's been terrible. It's been hard. It's been the worst thing ever. And yet it has made me who I am today. And it has helped me grow and blossom and learn things that I might never have learned otherwise. The grief and the pain that I have encountered so far has expanded me in ways I could not have orchestrated that for myself. I could not have read enough books or taken enough courses to learn what grief has taught me. And so suffering has shaped my transformation. It's been the sculptor of my transformation and the creator in some ways of who I have become to this point and who I am becoming in the future. And for me, that's also just a profound mindset shift in a way as I'm trying to adapt to this idea of embracing suffering and being in harmony with it, is to see that it is actually taking me somewhere. It's leading me somewhere. And it's a bit of a mystery. I don't fully know who I will be next week or next year or in 10 years. I don't fully know how life is going to play out. It's fascinating. And as the previous verse said, it's best not to overstir it or try too hard to control it or to try to push it in any one direction. Allowing it to unfold is part of the secret, in a way, of how we make the most of whatever life brings to us. And so the last verse I'll read today for us to dive into is verse number 70, and I'll read the whole thing. And I really love this one as well. I love all of these. This verse says, "The way of death is not hard to understand if you don't overthink it." There's a little bit of that paradox in a sense that you don't understand it so much by thinking too much about it. So the way of death is not hard to understand if you don't overthink it. It's not hard to practice if you don't try to control everything. There's surrender coming up in that verse. Death comes for everyone, whether they have prepared for it or not. That's a simple fact as old as time. Yet most people don't understand it because they avoid thinking about death. If you want to learn the way of death, just look deeply inside your own suffering. You'll find a precious gem hidden within its distressing disguise. So, wow, I just love this idea of looking inside your own suffering. And that's part of what the inward arc is. The inward journey is actually, instead of running away from or trying to control or eliminate our difficulties, going inside and going deep within the pain that we feel over our grief, our losses, our illnesses. And once we get there and we're able to go inside the suffering, that is where we find a precious gem hidden within the distressing disguise, the distressing appearance of the suffering and the difficulty of life. It is distressing. It's scary. And it's not something that we want to have in our lives. And yet it's there. Here it is. This is life. This is what life serves up to us. So by being able to look deeply inside, that is when we find the precious gem that is awaiting underneath that distressing disguise of our suffering. And as I read this, it makes me think, oh my goodness, the other book I mentioned that I'm just releasing, Stories from the Dark Night, the entire time I was doing this writing from within my grief, I was looking inside the suffering, and there were so many amazing gems hidden there, which is why when I say that book is not about the grief itself, it's actually about all the hidden gems that I found when I let myself just fall into the darkness, the dark night, and just fall into the suffering, just allow it to be present in my life. And when I did that, that's when all of these gems came to me. And so many of the stories and the essays that I wrote were gems hidden inside this time in my life, inside all the darkness, that helped me learn things I needed to know, helped me as my consciousness was expanding as I navigated my way through this very difficult and challenging grief process. So this is where these two books intersect, which in a way is why I'm releasing them at the same time. The Tao of Death is really a little book of wisdom for contemplation purposes. It's something to read one verse at a time, sit and think about it, write about it, go deep into some of the words and the lines that you read there. But you could easily read the whole thing in one day. But when you do that, you will not have any of the depth of these verses. So I recommend no more than one verse a day and spend the whole day thinking about it and thinking about the hidden meanings inside the verses. And the other book, Stories from the Dark Night, that's a totally different book with lots of kind of interesting writings to read, sometimes very inspiring stories, some that will bring a tear to your eye, some have some humor in them, some are raw and painful in a way to read, but they reveal the hidden gems that were within my dark night of grief. And so that book also contains writing prompts, though, that could be used if you would like to use writing yourself to work on grief. So I hope that you'll do some contemplation. I gave you, as I said, I recommend one verse a day, and here I read 4 verses today, but each one of them follows along this theme that our suffering is the path to transformation. And so I hope you'll contemplate that this next week, that idea. And I'm coming back next week with another one of the lessons from the Tao that we can really take within and use to help us grow spiritually. So until next week, remember, we're here for love. So face your fear, be ready for whatever life brings you next, and love each and every moment of your very precious life. Bye-bye.